It's definitely summer. The little waves are dancing and sparkling on the sea. Some people find it too hot to lie out on the beach and prefer to find a spot up here on the west cliff in the shade of the pine trees. Well, let's go in and have a cup of tea and a slice of cake. There'll be no charge.
Hello, I'm Peter John Cooper. I'm continuing my stories about some of the people and events that occur here in this little corner of the world, with a story called Busy Bee Finance. You may have spent an afternoon dozing in the sun on the west cliff and been hypnotised by the buzzing of the bees in the foxgloves. If you opened at least one eye and watched the little fellows at work, you would be amazed by how assiduous they are, visiting each flower in turn and busying themselves there before moving on to the next. Each visit helping the flower to propagate its pollen and receiving its just rewards in the form of delicious nectar. As any bee will tell you, exchange is no robbery, and after all, it is the flower that offers the reward in such a showy manner in the first place. Watching all this industry, you might just be reminded of a regular visitor to some of the apartments around the West Cliff, a small, dapper man who in this age of T-shirts and trainers still wore nicely polished shoes and neatly pressed trousers and a formal shirt with a black and yellow striped tie. Like all the rest of the denizens of this place, we never knew his name, but I christened him Nigel in my mind for the not very good reason that he reminded me of someone I knew at school. Nigel had retired several years ago from his lifelong career as a financial advisor, and from his demeanour we all reckoned he'd done all right for himself. But he still continued to offer his services to a few of his more mature lady clients who just wanted enough return on their capital to buy a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk from time to time. Nigel had never appeared to be one of those flashy whiz-kids who promised fabulous returns with speedboats and holidays on Mystique. He promised nothing, but advised safe little securities. He offered tea and toast rather than champagne and caviar. And for those clients who stuck with him, that was perfectly fine. And as the age of retirement passed, they valued him more for his regular visits than for any vision of unimaginable wealth. At their age, what would they do with a speedboat and Caribbean holidays whilst waiting for a new hip? So when every few months he pressed the buzzer and the apartment door opened, he was generally assailed by the smell of baking, that would then result in a pleasant hour or two with a pot of tea, a slice of cake, whilst the tennis played on the TV in the background. And here I must warn you against getting ahead of the story. If you are expecting shenanigans, then you are to be sorely disappointed. What Nigel offered was a little reassurance in an age of uncertainty. What his clients provided was a cup of tea, best china though, a slice of cake, and an hour or so of conversation. Nigel, always seeming miraculously to have found some little investment or saving account she never knew she had, but which always meant that there was enough to live on. And when advising on the making of a will, "You must see your solicitor for this," there was only the suggestion of a local cat's home if there was no family and friends had predeceased, a phrase beloved by will makers everywhere. Some of his clients demurred at this idea, and perhaps in memory of a dashing merchant navy officer they had known as a teenager, left their estate to the RNLI. But this raised no particular question in Nigel. It was of no concern of his. The RNLI seemed as good a bet to him as the poor homeless moggies. "It was purely a suggestion. I don't even have a cat myself. Not now." So, what was his angle? What was he up to? Hard to believe in this age of T-shirts and trainers that he had none, or seemed to have none. And this is where it gets difficult for me. You're lying there, lying on the grassy space, the sun beaming down, and you're listening to the buzz of the bees and the foxgloves. You are definitely wondering where the twist is. You're in holiday mode, and any moment you're expecting that little bee sting in the tail. You know, those foxgloves, they're full of digitalis, a heart stimulant that in overdose can send you into a sleep from which you'll never wake up. So when is this twist coming? There can't be much more of this story to go. And I have to tell you that perhaps you've missed it already. Perhaps you dozed off for a second and missed the very point I was making. No, don't turn back to the beginning. Let's just continue. There came that day when Nigel didn't call any more. He'd always been punctilious about timekeeping, so one of his more able clients, let's call her Mary, had rung the number on his card she had stored away in a folder of papers that all elderly people keep, just in case. There was, of course, no answer. His office was only a corner of his well-polished dining table, and there was no one else to answer the phone. There were no other clues as to his life, no address or email or message box number. And come to think about it, not even his name. His visiting card just had Busy Bee Financial Management and the number printed on. Mary felt herself reddening in embarrassment. All those years he had been visiting, and she had only known him by a business name. A few days later, at the co-op, she happened to run into someone else she knew by sight and whom she thought might be another client of Nigel. As it happened, she had also been in touch with other women who were also clients. No one had heard anything more of him. He had simply stopped calling. The conclusion that was reached was that something had happened to him. An accident, perhaps, lying in a hospital bed somewhere, alone, unvisited. But they all knew in their heart of hearts that he was dead. Mary was troubled by this. Neither she or any of his other clients knew anything of this man who dressed neatly and gave so generously of his time in return for little more than a cup of tea and a slice of cake. So Mary, who had been a journalist in a previous existence, decided to do a little research. And although she wanted to quell the thought, there was the tiniest suspicion that perhaps Nigel had been too good to be true. She had to know. Well, she drew a blank in all the obvious sources because she had no real name to go on. But out of desperation, she decided to try the Cat's Home that he had suggested. It turned out they had indeed received a small anonymous legacy recently from Busy Bee Finance. Only £50, hardly the result of a lifetime's financial wheeling and dealings, but for Mary it might just be a small clue. And she made an appointment to visit the solicitor who had handled the probate of Busy Bee's will. The solicitor was less generous with his time than Nigel had been. In the few minutes that he spared Mary, she learned that the estate he left was negligible. He had lived and worked from a small rented apartment. There were no living relatives that could be found, and they had never found any evidence that he'd ever been married. He had few possessions, the disposal of which had cost the small sum that was in his current bank account, along with outstanding bills for electricity and rent. The single legacy of £50 to the Cat's Home had come from a small deposit account that contained just that. And that was it. As she turned to go, the solicitor casually let slip that when the will was in probate, there had been some interest from Her Majesty's revenue. Busy Bee Finance at one time had been an extremely successful enterprise, and there was the possibility of what could amount to a large tax bill. But the large sums accumulated had been dispersed in such small amounts over recent years that they neither had the time or the manpower to launch an investigation, and they had decided to take no further action in the matter. And where it had all gone was of no concern of the executors. As far as probate was concerned, the will was proved and archived. So what did Mary know now? Well, Nigel had been wealthy enough once, but had died with only the precise amount that had been required to fulfil his obligations. Mary wondered where his money had gone, and whether he had indeed managed to pull off some massive tax fraud. But in the end she decided not to think about it. She only hoped that, whatever the reality, it had brought him some happiness. She preferred to remember him as someone who had given freely of his time to share a cup of tea and a slice of cake whilst watching a set or two from Wimbledon with her. Well, thank you for listening to that story. I'm sorry I have no further information about Nigel. If you think you know where Nigel's fortune went, you might like to contact Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, 100 Parliament Street, London, SW1A 2BQ. Or you may choose not to. I'll see you next week.